Sure, but this is kind of what this whole thing, this part of my talk is what I live for. This is what I spend most of my time doing on farms with groups. It's something new, it's something different, it's something old, and it's something that every farm, no matter the herd size, if you've got some of the larger farms that you're dealing with or 50 cow herds like where I came from when I grew up, this part of the whole thing I think is it's kind of revolutionizing, I think, a lot of ways we look at making forage. We're right on the ground floor of it. Everybody says I should write some stuff down because it's all in my head. And if something happens, that probably wouldn't be good. So, but it's unique. I don't see it too many other places. So we'll talk about it. And stop me for questions if you have them, because this is chewy. Dave and I talked about that last night and again this morning. Usually it takes 2 or 3 times to kind of go over it before you kind of figure it out. But once you figure it out, it makes like making forage easy. And when you wonder why you ever did it before. So, but it's chewy, and it takes some time to kind of go over and think about. But our goal is obviously to make the best quality forage. I just love this picture. Make the best quality forage that we can. It sounds easy. It's not easy. This is a slide that we live probably somewhere around here, right? And this is not a real chart, but I think it's a good chart. It's the Dreariness Index, and we're right in the middle of the Dreary Index. So there's other places that have it too, but we're pretty good at it right here. So, but with the Dreary Index, obviously, when you look at New York, when I go to talks, I've done a bunch of talks along with the King's line and Byron's line and different lines. And I've worked a lot with those companies too, and in flat states where like they get that little knoll and they're like, whoa, you should see how high that field is. When we all know there's certain farms that I work with, like in Chautauqua County, that I work a lot on the analytics side with this one farm, and he's got half his acreage at 300 elevation, and the other half is 1700. And he has a custom harvester come and do it. So how does that work when you're making halage and you're at 1700 and 300 and trying to make it work at the same time? It's pretty impossible, Dave, right? What he does, he's first and last because he pays his bill. So he goes first and last, but it doesn't always work that way, so something's going to suffer. He's either going to shave stuff out and shortcut stuff too early, or he's going to feed something blown out. So actually his custom harvester just retired, so he bought all of his equipment. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what that guy will do. But with New York, inherently we have so many regions in New York that it just makes, this is why I love New York. There's not many other reasons why I love New York, but there are a few. And I love New York for this reason. And the more I get into the Northeast, it's pretty similar to this too. So what I do is I do a lot of analytics stuff where I take a look at weather data, like we kind of touched on in the guy before me talked about, and whether you believe him or not, I don't know. But with this harvest analytics part, I take weather data and I take your forages and I look at like a 5-year average of forages. Because I could look at last year's forages, but that's last year. I look at 5 years, because after about 5 years of looking at every stitch of forage you sent in, it starts to make trends, for better or for worse. And that really gives you a lot of powerful information, because you can look at digestibility, you can look at tonnage, you can look at starch levels, harvest timing, fermentation, how well we're doing and managing our bunks, and whether we're using inoculants or not. I get lots of questions about fermentation, and if you dig deep enough, you can start to see trends. The guy wonders why he gets super high butyric silage, but then his average halage over the last 5 years was 29 dry matter. I mean, you just look at it and like, well, you wetted it in too much, or there's some issues, some hay in a day issues we got to work on, or some other issues, whatever the issues are. But I like to diagnose that. So I think it's taking the whole picture and then working with Mother Nature to kind of figure out how to make things better. So I've done nutrition for a long time. I still do nutrition. But about 20 years ago, I decided to start working with forages, because I had agronomists that would come in with a single page of of a corn silage sample that they said, you need to plant your whole farm to this. This is the best stuff ever. And then they plant it and it's clunky, and then I have to feed it for the next 18 months, or you guys have to feed it for the next 18 months. And so I like to say that I sit in the furrow between the agronomist and the nutritionist and the farm. I'm kind of like a translator, if that makes any sense. And this is pretty much, besides these talking gigs, which I love talking to you guys, and I love talking to Forage, but I'd rather be on farm than talking. But if I can get the point across for you guys to make better forage, I'll talk. My wife wonders when I come home from these things why I don't say a word. It's because I've talked for days. But I like that this is the thing that I think really makes milk and makes profitability. The harvest analytics thing, like I said, this is kind of a combination of a bunch of different things. Every spring I get excited about the spring because we can start over again. It's always nice. We can plant our corn, we can harvest our forages, we can take our rye and triticale off at the right time and get corn planted at the right time and have everything rolling along. So I look at every season as a clean slate. It's my favorite time of the year, but no, corn silage time is, no, the summer is every time of the year is my favorite time of year because we can all make good forage year round. But when we go through the seasons, who is tired by the time corn season or high moisture corn time comes around? Who wants to harvest forage anymore? Who wants to make those trips? So after a while, it just turns into things where you just want to get it off, and that's why I don't blame you for shortcutting your corn silage and harvesting it really early when you just want to get it off the field. That is what we want to do, and it's similar. I get it. I feel that pain. You guys see that pain as nutritionists. Every farm you go to, you see that struggle. So the idea is to kind of hit the bullets and kind of hit the dartboard and hit quality right where you want it. And it's different. For each farm, it's different. So most people look at forage quality as crude protein. Everybody looks at their forage sample and they get super excited because they see dry matter and they're like, oh, crude protein, or NDF, and then they're like, yeah, I'm done. There's so much there. And to me, I think it's real critical if you don't learn much else from what I was saying, besides the skunk thing and the dandelion thing coming up. You'll like those probably. But look at and learn your forage sample. Like, become friends with your forage sample, because our nutritionists are doing a super job trying to take that forage sample, translate it into the diets so that the cows can perform as efficiently and as economically as we can. But we have to take into consideration all the numbers on the forage samples, and we need to have a buy-in, us as dairymen. We need to look at the forage samples and buy into why they're good or why they're bad, and we need to own it. It's awful easy to take a nutritionist and say, yeah, I know we were a week late, but here, you can feed that. And then the next time you get the next grain truck rolls in, you're wondering why your cost of feed went up $20 a ton. And you're like, well, but you need to have a stake in the game. And I think by knowing these things puts a stake in the game. And it's human nature, I understand. But you could have goals of crude protein, of NDF, of looking at your RFV or RFQ. You can look at digestibility as your goal. To me, your goal depends on your split. And when I say split, I'm talking about split between corn silage and halage. If you're 50-50, halage, corn silage, your digestibility and your quality of that halage is going to be different than guys that are feeding 80% corn silage and 20% halage. When I look at Midwest dairies and try to look at their diets and their analytics, which I do a lot more of now, they're more 50-50. But that's good and bad. I moved to the Northeast, and 80-90% corn silage diets, would you guys say at times? For sure. You go down south into Florida, you go out west, you're looking at 30-40% forage diets, completely different diets. But for here, we have the unique ability to take advantage of the growing season that we had. Even though I complain about the growing season with mycotoxins, it's moderate. And the climate is right for forage. We make grass here that you can't make in the Midwest, you can't make in the South, you can't make in central United States. We've tried. Cherney did a really good study a few years ago. He's at Cornell, and he's probably done more on the grass forage side than most anybody, at least around here. He's taken meadow fescue. Anybody plant meadow fescue? Good, good. Meadow fescue's tight though, by the way, right, Rod? Okay. Meadow fescue, I like meadow fescue. It's great high quality feed. Maybe not super aggressive, but it's really, really good, and it matches well with alfalfa. But they took a study where they took meadow fescue in here, and then they put it in Kentucky, and it didn't work in Kentucky. It liked it up here. So when I talk about forages, I almost talk about anybody that, I don't know, I don't know if everybody, people like barbecue or that kind of, where you have where you smoke meat and it's really tender and it's got that smoke ring around it and all of that stuff, and everybody likes their barbecue, and it's basically slow and you're heating it slow. It's that real slow burn. Well, I equate the Northeast forages to that because you want that moderate. You don't want that huge upswing in heat. We have that moderate climate that is conducive to cereal grains and halages and grasses. And so to me, that's good. My wife, she wants chicken done in a minute, so she throws it into on the grill at 500 degrees and wants it, crispy, and she wants to bounce it on the floor like a basketball. I like it to be a little slower and more tender. So we make forages tender like that here. And that's just something that we can take advantage of and is our competitive advantage in the Northeast versus other places. So I'm going to go off into the weeds a little bit, and I apologize if I do, but I just want to explain a few things kind of simply. It's always more difficult than this, but I like to break things down a little bit. So NDF, has everybody ever seen NDF on your forage samples? Good, this is a great crowd. You're all friends, I love it. NDF equals intake. It's a little more difficult, but it's pretty simple. So the higher the NDF, the less they're going to eat. The more energy potential of that feed. The lower the NDF, the higher the energy potential and the higher the intake. The rate of passage will be faster. That's pretty simple. In the rumen, it's a little more difficult than that, but I equate it to like filling up a bucket. You've got to have that NDF, and we're always fighting that battle as nutritionists of looking at a battle between fill and fuel. Physical fill of getting the girl, cows want to eat because they want to eat and they like to be full, and we like to get them full, but yet we don't want to have them full and they don't get anything out of it because they don't milk. And we also don't want to have so much fuel that there's not enough fiber and fill. We know what happens. Our fat test goes down, we get potentially sore feet, we run into issues, and we want to have that balance. And that's the goal of hitting that balance that we want to get to. RFV, RFQ, I'm sure everybody maybe has heard of those, right? Who looks at RFV? Who looks at RFQ? Good, I see some hands. They are different from each other. They don't go in the ration, so it doesn't really, the number doesn't matter, but everybody wants that one number. Everybody wants that milk per ton. They want that RFV, RFQ. RFQ takes into consideration the digestibility of the feed more so than RFV. If you have legumes or alfalfa, look at your RFV. If you have anything else, grasses, cereal grains, look at RFQ because it takes into consideration digestibility. I have farms that, I keep playing with that. I have farms that have digestibilities that are super high on their cereal grains, their triticale. But if you look at the RFV, I have some nutritionists that are so focused on RFV, they'll say, wow, your RFV's 120. This is garbage. But your RFQ, which takes into consideration the fragility and the digestibility, is 160. And the goal is you want to have your RFQ 160, 170 range. So it's great feed, but if you're looking at a different parameter, it doesn't show it right. So going back again, like I said, NDF, higher NDF is not a good thing. Lower NDF D30, which a lot of people look at 30-hour digestibility as a measure for relatively quick digestibility. And UNDF, which, has anybody heard of UNDF? Oh my gosh, this room's great. But UNDF 240 is a number that we use now in the industry, and I think we're going to continue to use it, and I think we can refine it and keep going with that number. And we'll talk about what that is. But when you have these three combinations, typically things are not going to go well. You're going to make components typically, but you're not going to make milk because you're hitting that ceiling of quality and fiber. But when you go the other way, That's when you're making money, and that's when things are efficient, and cows are eating 70% forage, making 70 to 80 pounds of milk, and you get quality feed. That's the key to it. So you got to control it. And then it gets more difficult and more modern. If you've been feeding cows for enough years, it used to be magic and mystical, and you used to just have to be a feel thing. Because the forage samples said certain things, and our ration programs were okay, but it was a feel. Now we're starting to go back. I can take diets that I did 20 years ago and look at them and put them into the program, the models now, and I look at them now and I go, oh yeah, I know why they were making, 30,000 pounds 20 years ago. You just look at the diet and it makes sense now. And it's just that the industry is kind of catching up with how to read samples. So you look at this Ndf D12, which is the next thing that I really am interested in. I'm looking at it a lot on Forages. Ndf D30, like I said, is a faster thing, but not as fast as 12. If you make gorgeous, gorgeous alfalfa, that Ndf 12 is going to be so fast, it's just going to be lightning fast through the diet. And then sometimes you can run into fiber issues if you're feeding a BMR, a super high quality corn silage. But I put these in last night. You get special ones from the group yesterday. This is from Dairyland. So green is alfalfa. There's a reason why we typically, if we can grow alfalfa, there's a reason why you grow alfalfa. We get protein out of it. There's a reason why we get ash in our feed, and typically alfalfa likes to do that too, because the ash levels are higher. Right here, this is the percent of the samples. This is the ash level or the number. Ndf digestibility, there's lower Ndf. Remember, Ndf is intake. There's lower Ndf in alfalfa. 12, look how explosive. If you make alfalfa really, really, really good, it can be super explosive compared to cereal grains and grasses and sorghum Sudans. How many do rye triticale in the spring? Man, this is a great group. I really love those variety. I love those species and working with them, and I work with them a lot. I've probably spent most of my last few talks, the last couple of weeks, talking about rye and triticale. I spent last week in Maryland and Lancaster County discussing that with hundreds of people. So I really love that part of it. And Ndf digestibility, you're going to get, obviously, you see this right here, Ndf D30. You look at these numbers, and then you look at UNDF numbers, and these are just basically the way the numbers look. And I won't blind you with this, but the only thing I'll blind you with is, see these numbers right here, all these black lines, and how consistent everything is? You don't have to worry about the numbers. This is alfalfa. There's a reason why alfalfa is pretty tried and true and consistent. Now, granted, there's more samples here too. But when you start looking at small grain silage like triticale or rye, see the differences? Tim had mentioned earlier today talking about how you can make really good forage quality and a lot of digestible feed, or you can make wood. And that's the thing with some of these grasses and cereal grains, is if you miss the boat goes away pretty quick. Like on triticale, you've got 5 days at the most, 4 days. Rye, sometimes you have 2 to 3 days to hit it right. So that's something to look at. UNDF, undigestible NDF. So the amount of NDF the cows eat, the intake, this is what goes in the gutter or we spread in the field. UNDF, undigestible NDF. So, and we look at it at 240 hours. In the lab, that's kind of the UNDF 240 was a number, because after 10 days, if it's not digested, it's probably not getting digested. I could grind up this chair, and there would be something that would get digested out of it in rumen fluid, but the majority wouldn't. So it would have a real high UNDF 240. So this just basically means what we're spreading in the field. It's a little more difficult than that. How many freestall herds? Some freestall, tie stall. Okay. There's time, but Rick Grant has done some stuff on time budgets, and it's really, really great information. I like to go to the next level of this, because if you're overcrowded and your UNDF, undigestible NDF, is really high, then your rate of passage is going to be slower, And especially if you're overcrowded, it typically is going to, in essence, take you 28 hours to eat 24 hours a day of feed. That's why when they dry up 10 cows, they go up a certain amount of milk. Or you dry up a big whack of cows, or they sell them off because of the quota. Cows go up in milk and it doesn't fix the problem, right? So this is one of the big things, is you've got to track that. And if you're way overcrowded, the herds that seem to do a better job, have that UNDF number under control for the whole ration. And that's why this is going to be, I think, a big part of the whole equation. When you look at digestibility, I won't bore you too much with this graph because it is busy. This is BMR. This is, when it was done in 16, but this is 25,000 samples. So it's quite a bit of samples. BMR was then this was out of Cumberland Valley. This was 68 NDFD 30. Conventional corn silage was 58, 10-point difference like you see in all the stuff. Remember, half a pound, every 1% increase in digestibility is a half a pound of milk. So think about how important that is. And then we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But you look at mixed grasses here, rye, triticale are in here too. But when you start looking at alfalfa, alfalfa is not nearly as digestible as some of these other forages. That's why we feed a lot of corn silage, and that's why other herds that are 50-50 Halage corn silage, if you don't make great Halage, you're going to limit yourself on milk, just because of this right here. And then if you look at UNDF, which is the undigestible part, this is in essence saying that as a percent of NDF, this is saying that 87% of that BMR is used by the cow and 12% is in the gutter. That's a lot. Regular corn silage is around 25 to 30%, which is still 75% they're using. Get over here to alfalfa. They're using 60% of it, but 40% is going somewhere else, not in the cow. So that's the chink in the armor with alfalfa. Yes?
So, I'm not a nutritionist, so
no,
I'll explain my thinking.
No, you're great. Yeah.
68.2 plus 12.6 is like 80.8. So what happens to the other 20?
Well, so if you look at this is NDFD 30. This is how quick it's digested at 30 hours. And this is how basically at 240 hours, this is what's left at 240. They're just kind of different. We're looking at things of how things digest. The rumen bugs want something quick. And basically, you look at every piece of feed, and some of it digests quick, some of it's intermediate, some of it's slow, and some of it doesn't get used. And this is really the part that doesn't get used.
So that other 20% is used, but it takes longer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's just the different. Basically, it's still got a ways to go yet. It's still cooking, for lack of a better term. And we know nothing stays in a cow typically 10 days. I mean,
that 12.6, that's what goes into the manure.
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's a little more difficult, but pretty simply, that's what it is. So when you look at what I think is fascinating, and my alfalfa friends, I did a Byron alfalfa talk, and I was not popular there, and which is, I'm really popular with the Saskatchewan crowd that makes all alfalfa. They hate me, which is fine. Because I put up a slide that had a picture of alfalfa hay and a bale of straw, big bales of straw and big bales of alfalfa hay, and I said alfalfa's green straw, and nobody liked that. But so there's a limit to it. I love alfalfa because I love the fragility of the leaves versus the stem. The average leaf RFV or RFQ or RFV, sorry, average RFV of the leaves is around 300 to 350. So that's why you want to carry the shovel, and you scoop the shovel up and throw it into the mixer. The stem is 70 to 90. Big difference. But when you look at grasses, you have those nice digestible leaves, or not leaves, but plant material. And that is just so much more digestible than the stem. Because if you look at a stem of alfalfa and a stem of wheat, do they look that much different except for the color? I mean, a little bit. But so this just shows right here the limitation. This yellow line right here is straw. And this yellow line here is straw. So really, there are limitations to alfalfa. But I do like alfalfa. I'm not saying I don't. I sound like I don't, but... Because if you, in Penn Yan, in this Finger Lakes area, can we grow alfalfa here? Oh, yeah. We can grow great alfalfa here. So I don't complain in areas that can, but if you get to some clunky areas like where I work with more in over further in western New York or eastern New York or northern New York, they try to do it, but that doesn't work. So don't try something that doesn't work on your ground. And then they start looking at more modern numbers. John Gazer did this 2019. For every 1% increase in the UNDF, which is the stuff we spread in the gutter, or spread in the field, sorry. For every 1% increase in UNDF is 1.3% fat-corrected milk. We start losing milk really quick. This is the next stage, PEUNDF. I don't want to bore you with it and lose your mind over it, but you've got undigestible forage and you've got length of cut. And there's a marriage between those two. If you have feed that's really late, like if you miss the window by a week on your rye or triticale and it's headed out, and you need it for cows, chop it fine. You want to help the cow. Chop it fine so she's doing less work. And that's what this PEUNDF number stands for. Physically effective UNDF. It's a marriage between length and digestibility. And when you look at it, the numbers really, really make sense as the higher that the PEUNDF number, the lower the intake, and the same thing that goes with milk. So at the end of the day, I think while I'm trying to sum up with all that garbage I just gave you, was we got to find the sweet spot for our feed. No matter what the crop is, we need to find the sweet spot. So NDF, remember intake. NDF increases 0.5 to 1% a day, which if it's Friday or Thursday and it's going to rain on Saturday, maybe, we think, if we wait and get through the weekend till Tuesday, it'll be all right. So if you look at the NDF alone, it's going to increase 3%. What's 3%? On rye, triticale, and grasses, it's big. Doesn't seem like a lot, but then when you start looking at NDF digestibility, the 30-hour, the quicker part of that, it decreases 1.5 to 3% a day. Even though the NDF just creeps up a little, digestibility starts going that way. Then you look at UNDF, which is what we spread in the field, that can increase 2 to 5% a day, per day. So we wait that weekend, and then all of a sudden our feed value, even though the NDF is not bad and the protein's not bad, but it's more bound up and the digestibility is a lot lower. So this is really critical to hit the sweet spot. And that's why I'm always in a flux between quality and quantity, and you want to hit both. And I think I've found a way to hit both, but you've got to kind of get that out of your mind sometimes, thinking, I'm going to wait another 3 days and get a bunch more hay, when what happens is you miss the boat, and then you get a week's worth of rain at the end of May. Who gets 5 days of rain the last week of May, first week of June? We almost always do in western New York. So those guys that miss it are in trouble because we have run into problems with cuttings. So I like to work with farms playing fields and basically try to figure out what works best for the individual farm. So I use Phenology, which is basically the study of when leaves start blooming or start budding, when robins come back in the spring. There's a certain growing degree days that robins come back in the spring. There's a certain growing degree days for apple blossoms to blossom, for dandelions to start to bud and to bloom. And the same thing with all of our forages. All of these people track this Phenology stuff all over the country that are doing they're doing their little garden stuff. But when you can take that and harness that information to make better quality forage, it really is powerful then compared to looking at it another way. So like I said, you want to be on that one side or the other. If you wait, your neighbor, that neighbor that is always the lucky neighbor, the one that for some reason always seems to make milk, he always seems to have really good hay, he always plants his corn silage or his corn first and gets his corn off, he's so lucky. Everybody says that. But a lot of times you create your own luck. And if we wait on our first cutting till after that rain comes through, what happens is it gets hot in June, it dries out, and we don't get second cutting. And if the guys that hit it right before that wall came or that wall of rain came, they take advantage of the heat, they take advantage of the water, they get a good second cutting. So sometimes if you take a cut on first, a little bit less on first cutting, and you hit that rain just right and you get good growth, you'll make up for it with your second and first together. But those guys that cut after that rain, usually in June, they lose a second or a third cutting. They get it, but how many times have we mowed stuff down and just kind of forgot about it? Or just ran around the field and tried to windrow it 7 times or whatever to get it to work.
So what's the philosophy on the bud stage? Harvesting at bud stage or early blossom, early bloom? You don't take that into consideration at all?
I do. So it's a combination of things. So the growing degree day thing, I've done it so much that I can pretty much tell the growing degree days and look at the bloom, and I can almost tell people within 3 days of when they should harvest. Pretty close. Certain varieties, there are varietal differences between different alfalfas and different grasses and rye and triticales, but they basically going to be the same way. I'm still the 5%, I still don't mind, looking at the 5%, bloom or bud stage, because alfalfa has a long tail to it. So she's a little more, she doesn't mind to go a little longer, where grasses, they're gone. Rye. You miss the window on rye, you look the other way and it's gone. And that's why with alfalfa you've got a little wiggle room, but it depends. If you've got my question to that would be, do you feed more corn silage than haylage? If you feed more haylage than corn silage or equal, you got to make that as, really, really pretty prime. So there is a mix to that. So the growing degree day thing, I'll explain this a little bit and we'll keep rolling. Grasses, rye, triticale, dandelions, any cool season grasses, they basically bloom or start to break their dormancy at 3 nights in a row above 32 degrees. Now there's a little more to it than that because of sunlight, but normally after March 1st, grasses kind of wake up. Alfalfa, we know, typically we've always thought of alfalfa as base 41, and it just basically wakes up and breaks its dormancy at a different time than grasses. Grasses are early. That's why there's usually a week, 10 days for alfalfa. I put them on the same scale just for ease, because I don't want to go back and forth from scales, because this is confusing enough, than to go back and forth to different things. So I stick with base 32 for all forages except for corn, which corn is base 50 and 86. Even though Grandpa always used to say when corn was 95 degrees, oh, you can hear that grow. If we get it above 95 degrees, it starts to slow down, and you can take an infrared camera and look at a cornfield, and it'll be red on an infrared camera if it's stressed. And it's typically because we get those streaks of hot weather. It's warm nights that make the big difference, right, Rod? So when you look at growing degree days, high temperature plus low temperature, basically what you're doing is you're getting your average temperature of the day. And so if you're using a scale of 41, which like I said, I use 32, I got to change this. But if your average for the day is 70 degrees and 41 is your base, you just subtract 70 from 41, so that individual day you'd get 29 growing degree days. And you just keep adding. From March 1st, you just add those numbers up. And I've gotten it to a point where I have a scale where we can figure out, depending on what forage you have, I can figure out pretty darn close to what you're going to do and when you need to harvest. If you think if your days are cold in the spring, you don't add anything to it. You don't subtract, you just keep going. So with dandelions, I found that I started tracking the growing degree days of dandelions because I'm crazy. And when you track them, I found how close they are to grass. It's insanely close, because we'll get dandelions to have that stage where too many dandelions in these pictures, where you've got dandelions that kind of look like this, and I'm not talking about the ones that are outside the barn door or right by the house or up against the house. I'm talking about the ones in the field. You'll start to see them bud. You'll have roughly 12 to 18 days from when you get this stage to when we go to seed. And it's based on heat. Moisture, unfortunately, is not part of this equation. But when you look at that, you have that amount of time. When you start to get about here, right when you start, and I am nuts, like I said, when you start looking at these the dandelions, instead of them being that nice yellow color where the petals are straight out, we're starting to get mustard color and dingy. And then you also start to see the fuzz climb up that dandelion. We all know if we make really great quality feed, you've got that fuzz in a lot of our baleage or our halage, and that seems to be great feed. I work with a farm, a lactating sheep herd. Anybody milking sheep? Does anyone milk sheep? Not here, I mean in general. But they milk sheep. They have the highest herd average in the nation. And you can tell they're making tons of milk. So to equate it, the average sheep makes 4 pounds of milk a day. Doesn't sound like much. They average 12 to 14 pounds a day. And they get them to 16 to 18 pounds a day. And the only reason I'm doing this story is we were walking together, and she's like really out there smart. She just knows, she's like your best dairy times 10. And we were talking about forage, and she says, yeah, I buy all my forages in. I buy all the best forage I can, which she does. And she pays a premium for it, but she makes it up in the genetics and what she sells things for. But she says, the best time of year? She says, the best feed I think I've ever seen is dandelions. And she says, I make so much milk off of dandelions. And I'm like, okay. And she says, tell me what's so good about dandelions. It's because she's putting them out at the perfect time. It's nothing to do with the dandelions. She's matching up the grass pasture to hit that dandelion with the spring flush like we all understand. So she's hitting that window just right. So then I take the growing degree days. This has Canadian and this has Celsius and Fahrenheit on it. But I basically take the growing degree days, and I have a part of my chart for dandelions, grasses, and you've got them, your early native grasses through the whole grasses, grass mixes, and I got alfalfa or legumes right here. Clover's going to be in between, and then cover crops are going to be out in this range. And we'll talk about that because I know there's a lot in here that have it. So this is kind of the chart, and if you hit this chart and hit within the window, you're going to get what you want to get out of your forage. If you know it's a mix, you're going to want to be, close to a different growing degree day than that. So this is North Java, New York, which, I don't know, there's nothing in North Java, New York. Actually, Reisdorf Brothers. Huh? That's true. I forgot about, yeah. So there's two things. There's Java Farm Supply and Reisdorf Brothers, right? There's two places in North Java. So that's a great point. Don't tell them I said that, right? My next tractor won't be from there. So this is North Java, New York. 600, and this was when I was using base 41, but 680 growing degree days. Just think of this date, or the growing degree days. To hit 680 growing degree days from 2009 to 2019, to hit that one growing degree day number, 680, look at the difference, May 15th to May 30th. When do you make feed? When do you make that grass? When do you make your triticale? When do you make your alfalfa? When you have a 2-week difference between all the years. It's really tough, and it ever changes every year, so that's why you start looking at this stuff. So, Scipio Spring, anybody close to there? I guessed at 2%. Good, but we're close. Because actually, when I looked at Alexander, New York yesterday, we were close to this. This is confusing looking, but it will simplify it really quick. 2010, 2021, March 1st, June 1st. This is spring in central New York, or Finger Lakes. Okay. Don't predict spring, and don't predict how a spring's going to be till we get to about the 10th of May. Because see how everything flattens right out and it gets really consistent? We had our 10 and our 12 and our 21. We had these outlier years. Who remembers 2012? Probably. But it flattens out and it gets consistent. But if you're right here around April 5th or April 1st to May 10th, look what the individual springs do. Drives us crazy. Makes me wonder why we even dairy here when you look at the differences in the spring and trying to get fertilizer on at the right time and trying to figure out when to harvest and when to plant corn. When I go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, anywhere in the Midwest, their whole spring looks just like this. It's just fine and fancy and 5 days apart. And then we get to here, and it's just a mess. But it does figure itself out. But that's why this growing degree day thing is so pertinent to here, because we're figuring out in season when we need to make feed. And using this, I can go, if you're using a custom harvester, I can usually tell you, yeah, you're probably 12 days away, and be pretty close. So you can get ahead of your neighbors if you have a custom harvest guy do it. This is some Scipio Springs again. Grasses are, this is basically May 1st to June 5th. Grasses are here from basically May 8th to May 26th. And then if you look at legumes, the spring figures itself out to get to summer. So if you look, see how close your window for alfalfa is, May 29th to June 5th. It's pretty much in that window to get to the growing degree days. And it's going to be a little bit off depending on if you have grasses in it or if it's pure. But I use this Climate Smart Farming. Again, like I said, it's a website that I use. It's free. It's from Cornell. It's climatesmartfarming.org, and it tells you pretty much the story. So I start with March 1st. You put your own address in. I start with March 1st, or you can have anybody else do it. I'm sure Leland will roll around with his phone or his computer and be happy to work on it for you. Sorry, Leland. Or Rod would do it for sure. Or your nutritionist should, I actually work with a lot of consultants and nutritionists where I actually figure out myself. They have farms in 10 different areas in New York, and I will actually send out weekly a growing degree day report for their individual. They have, say they have a couple farms here, a couple farms here, a couple farms here. I figure out and I send them weekly a growing degree day report so they can tell their customers, because too much of our business is reactionary when we need to be a little more proactive with making forage. So planting date I put here. I use the base 32, which is for cool season grasses. This is frost. This is frost. The black line is a 100-year high. The black line on the bottom is a 100-year low. The purple and the blue are 15 and 30-year averages for your address. That's why it's so powerful, because it's your place. And then this tracks it all, and it's free. That's another good thing. So, for Auburn, New York, which I know there's nobody milking in Auburn. Well, there probably is, but not like in town. But if you look, I like to see my rye or triticale to be harvested at around 800 growing degree days. Rye is going to be a touch earlier, but 800 is the number. If you get to flag leaf, where the flag leaf is just popping out, still rolled tight, but she just pops out about an inch or so, or two, and you split that stem in half, because we got to still go bend the field. You split the stem, that head's going to be barely visible. It's going to be 6-8 inches down, really, really vegetative. I had a farm that was in Stanley, New York, last year that they had harvested because they needed to harvest some, and they harvested it at like 650 growing degree days instead of 800, and you'll see the results on that here too. But so for 800 is the number I like to use. So a 15-year average would say you should be making your harvesting your rye or triticale or triticale, however you want to use the word, at around May 11th on average. But if you look at 2021, it shows season to date too. So we were about 100 growing degree days ahead of the 15-year average. So it was earlier last year than it normally is. So you've got to pay attention to in season, so it does that. People talk about global warming, right? And we all, thank you for rolling eyes. Is it there, Dave? Global warming? Good job. You always have those great analogies. I just love it the way you hammer those home. Okay, global warming. I work with the National Phenology Network. That's where I get some of my stuff from. And she talks about, she's a weather person that lives in Seattle. And she's like, global warming, global warming, global warming. She isn't in Western New York. 15-year to get 800 growing degree days in Auburn, New York on a 15-year average, 15-year average from March 1st to May 11th, 798 growing degree days. 30 years from March 1st to May 11th, 800. That 2 degrees of global warming is not there. So, I mean, there are issues and bouts of more heat and more weather. I get that. But so May 11th for roughly around May 11th for a 15-year average for rye and triticale. Grasses, if you're mostly all pure grass, you're around 950. That's May 18th. If you're looking at 1,200 growing degree days, which is going to get you between bud, right at basically bud stage and maybe 2% bloom, you're going to be at around 1,175 to 1,200 growing degree days. That's going to be May 27th. Do these dates somewhat look normal to when we would harvest? And it's, like I said, individual per season that makes the big difference. So we saw this chart earlier. Leland had asked that really good question about Ndf digestibility and the UNDF. The only reason I bring this back, because I updated it this year for my Lancaster folks, is we have BMR corn silage, we have conventional corn silage, but I added cereal forage in because I'm such a lover of rye and triticale. I love this type of forage in sorghum Sudans. But the spring cereal, the winter cereal forages, cool season, look at the Ndf digestibility. Here's BMR, here's conventional corn silage. This is cereal grains in the spring if we make it right. But this number here is the average. So when you look at the average for the whole Northeast, there's stuff that's really missed the boat and stuff that's really early. The average is 64. That's digestible fiber, and that's as good as you're going to get on digestible fiber. You can't find much else that's going to be close to that. You look at the UNDF, right in between where BMR is and conventional corn silage, that sits right there. I had a farm that I used to work with that was always number 2 or number 3 in herd average in Ohio back years ago when I lived in Ohio and was doing a lot of work there. And they always made a ton of milk, and they still make a ton of milk. Actually, they were at, does anybody know pounds of components? You guys do, yeah. They're 7.5 right now, which is really good. Now, they don't milk a ton of cows, but still. And I remember back then they made 23% alfalfa. Great alfalfa. Good corn silage, great alfalfa. And whenever they switched to their wheatlage or rylage, cows always went up in milk, got loose, muns always dropped a little bit, but they just fixed the protein, and then they went up in milk every year. And he was like one of those dairies that he was such a good feeder that I just as a nutritionist just didn't want to get in the way. He was such a good, I just kind of gave him information, and he's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense, I'm going to do it. And we all know dairies like that, and hopefully we are dairies like that. But we noticed that, and I saw that back then, and now it's made such a huge change, and there's so many people using that type of spring forages now. Whether you're in Ontario, I have a herd in Maine that I work a lot with that's doing it. Double cropping in Maine. I would have never thought I'd see that. But we do. Ontario, we see it. I've got a guy in North Harbor, Ontario, which is 4 or 5 hours north of Toronto, and they're working on doing it, which makes you worry, but we'll see. So, forages, I know this is blinding, but this is triticale, rye, wheat, small grain silages, which will probably be millets and some others, sorghum Sudan, legumes like alfalfa or clover, and grasses. When you look at protein, the green one's alfalfa. Obviously, alfalfa is the queen of protein, right? Or when you look at NDF, we know NDF is lower in alfalfa. We know that digestibility in alfalfa is lower. And we know that the UNDF, the part that gets spread in the field, on alfalfa compared to these other crops. So there's a benefit to having some of these alternative forages if we can plant them and if we can manage them right. And there's a trick to managing them right. You want your NDF to be between 48 and 52 on these cereal grains. If you're over 50, go home tonight, and if your NDF is over 52 and your NDF digestibility is under 60, 30 hour, then we missed the boat. When you start to see the flag leaf come all the way out, still rolled up, Kilser would argue with me, and we do. Anybody know Tom Kilser? Oh my gosh, everybody knows him. He did move to Tennessee, you know that, right? But he wants the flag leaf to be open because you're going to maximize tonnage, which I agree with. But when you look at Ndf digestibility, it plummets when you get that flag leaf open. When you start to see that head is peeking out, he would say, oh yeah, you missed it by a day, but it's pretty good. Ndf digestibility drops, like dramatically. So I like my flag leaf to be all the way up and still closed. But some of them are going to be starting to open, and I like the head to be about 1 inch to 2 inches from coming out of the boot. That's where you're going to maximize quality, and you're not going to hurt yourself on quantity too much. Now, it sounds simple if you've got 1,000 acres to do. It's not as easy. You know, I talked to a group in Florida farms we were talking about yesterday, and they've got, you know, with us, we have to harvest or plant our triticale or rye at one point because we're just getting out of corn and getting it in. It's going to get weather, it's going to get bad. We have a deadline. They're making, they planted rye or triticale this month, and this month, but they're going to harvest it all at the same time, which when we look at it, it doesn't make sense. But when you have that many acres, you have to do what you have to do. So there's certain numbers that we want to get in. We don't want our alfalfa to be typically above 40, 42 NDF, 38 to 40, depending on the split of corn silage and halage. You want to have that NDF down because you're going to get some better feed quality out of it. Looking at forage samples, doesn't matter what lab you're using. Don't just look at protein. Don't look at just dry matter, protein, and NDF. Start looking at your digestibilities. Start looking at your sugar levels. Start looking at your fermentation, how things fermented, because that's important. This was a slide from last week or 2 weeks ago or whenever it was, comparing alfalfa to rye and triticale in Lancaster County and Maryland for the most part. And you look at the crude protein difference in alfalfa, you look at the NDF difference, lower NDF in alfalfa, kind of what we've already talked about, but the digestibility between the two is 18% difference. That's 9.5 pounds of milk. So alfalfa has its advantages, and if you can grow it, grow it. But if you can't, there's other alternatives. I'll skip over this. This was for a herd that I work with, do a lot of consulting with. Yes, that was at the meeting yesterday. And, you know, we looked at individual fields because I not only want to look at growing degree days, I want to go walk around the field, I want to split stems, but I also, for some customers, to dial in forage even better, I will go and pre-harvest sample about a week before you're going to chop. You can look at the growing degree days and figure that out and cut it at 4 inches or whatever, 3 inches, 4 inches, wherever you're cutting it. I find a representative sample and I send that in and I pre-harvest sample because that'll tell me where the NDF is and it'll tell me where the digestibility is. And there are times when growing degree days lie and it's farther along than we think it is, or it's not as far along as we think it is. So I like to actually look at a pre-harvest sample and say, yeah, I think we should probably go a touch earlier or maybe go a little later. I know it sounds like a lot, but with our size dairies in this room, we need a competitive advantage, and our competitive advantage is to make great feed because we can do great feed here. But if you look at this was last spring. I asked him, I talked to him after the meeting yesterday, and he said, I said, I knew you knew what it was because he could probably see the names of his fields here. But when you look at it, his protein ranged, so remember, planted the same day, same amount of fertilizer, all different fields. He ranged from 11.5% protein to 20. Remember, same everything. Soil types, differences in the field make a lot of difference. So, you know, there are going to be variations amongst it. When you look at it in a bunker, a silo, it kind of all melds together, but differences. I like to see rye and triticale basically the same as grasses, 48 to 52, but that 48 to 50 window, I like to see the NDF there. He was pretty darn close. NDF digestibility, I picked on Sean yesterday, but I'll probably pick on Aaron today. Aaron, if your herds could have cereal grains with those digestibilities, how do you think that works? Yeah, pretty good. Almost, well, BMR corn silage was 68. So when you can get them like that, that's impressive and really good to do. There is wiggle room in this, and you look at the UNDF differences between them, and they're huge, because that's a lot of feed that they're actually using. And then when you look at the ash level, I cut everything myself, and I cut everything at 4 inches. Now we know ash levels on cereal grains are a little lower than alfalfa, but that was what ash levels are without contamination. So we do see some situations where it's more. This is what I was talking about with the flag leaf coming out. Tape measure. I do expensive, really fancy things. Right here is where the head is starting to develop. Flag leaves here, heads here, boots right about 6 inches roughly. This is that guy I was talking about that made feed early. He made it at 709 growing degree days. I said 645 was 709. Ndf was 41. Remember I said 48 to 50? He was at 41. He made it really early, but he had to. He was out of feed. Plus he wanted to get some longer day corn on the ground. His Ndf digestibility was 80, which is crazy. 80 is hard to feed. Really hard to feed, because you don't have enough fiber. A week later, 512 to 517, it was 800 growing degree days, because we left some. And we took a sample again. It had dropped in protein from 15 protein down to 11, but he also didn't put enough fertilizer on in the spring. Ndf digestibility Ndf went from 41 to 46. Ndf digestibility went from 80 to 65. It dropped like a rock. So these are how violent and quick these changes are in the diet. How are we doing on time, Rod? Okay. This is a farm I worked with in Western New York when I first moved to Western New York. They were making triticale, but it was like a heifer feed or a dry cow feed or anything that the cows might eat. It just feed. So we started working together. It was my first real go-around with it. They were making it at the right dry matter, but the first year, 10% protein, 14% protein the second year. They fertilized it, kind of. They didn't put, like Kilser will suggest, like 100 pounds of urea, 125 pounds of ammonium sulfate on it, and that's Tom's suggestions. We all know Tom, right? Yeah. So he would argue about it for sure. But if you look at the NDF, his first year I worked with him, it was heifer feed, 10% protein, NDF of 60, woody. That's woody feed. Digestibility still wasn't bad because it's triticale and it's not horrible. It's 55. But once we figured it out that we were going to start feeding it to milk cows because they were having trouble with their alfalfa stands, we started to do a better job. We started fertilizing better. We started harvesting early. Remember I said 48 to 50, and he was hitting it pretty good. Look at the digestibility difference he made by just hitting the windows right. For you guys, it's critical to hit the windows just right, especially if you're using a good percentage of small grains. Planting in the fall, I use this Climate Smart Farming. There's a little tool that's at the back, but it's basically for crop establishment for the end of the season. This is for rye. You put in your actual address, or Leland can do it, or Rod can do it, or your nutritionist can do it. Put in your address, switch it to rye, and this shows probability of cover crop establishment, but I use this for if you miss the window. If we miss the window and plant corn, like we have trouble getting our corn off and we plant our triticale or rye really late, what happens in the spring? Is it a good crop or not as good? Do we get as much tonnage? Rod, is there a difference between a cover crop and a winter forage?
Not really.
Huh?
Not really.
No? What about when you get, if you don't get it in right?
Doesn't impact you.
Correct. And that's the big thing. Whether you look at, that's the whole terminology thing, whether you think of it as a cover crop or you're using it as more of a winter forage. But when you look at planting date, and I use this, like I said, once you get to, in Auburn, New York, 15-year average, once you get to September 30th, things fall off pretty darn quick. So what I do is if you're planning on having rotations like you do have them and utilizing double crops, which I would say don't go all in on that because it's pretty risky. You still have to have your alfalfas because we do live in the Finger Lakes. But when you look at this is right here is the 15 and 30 year this is the 30-year history. You've got between a window between 923 and 930 and at the latest 10.4. If you get past that, you're probably not going to get the tonnage next spring that you want to get. So this is really, it's not meant for this, but I find a way to make things work. Advanced Ag Systems, this is Tom's newsletter that is a must read. I read it every month like 3 times because I never get enough out of it the first time. Here's what he's talking about the nitrogen. Real world, when you look at a ration program and you look at how incredible that triticale can be to what it's when it's not. See this right here? Like I said, I'm pretty visual. This is the undigestible pool of a low-quality rye or triticale. This is what high quality looks like. This is basically what the rumen is seeing on this rate of passage UNDF thing. It's what basically we're putting in the diets, and the kinetics of that ration are being based off of a lot. This is a huge difference from here, from there to there. Cocktail mix, Sean's going to do a great talk about cocktail mixes coming up. They're great feeds. Yield max out here, combinations, and Sean's going to talk a lot about that. I tie growing degree days to that too, and I was working with this in Wisconsin, and we started working on tracking the growing degree days of when we planted the different harvest dates to when we planted it to when we harvested, so I could track the growing degree days because you can track that too. So this is kind of some information about that, and like I said, I won't really hit on it too much, but it's amazing how quickly those numbers rise and how mature that crop sometimes can get. Yield max is a little bit easier because of what's in it, but it's a constant game of chicken with Mother Nature. Let's see. Corn silage, we'll skip through a lot of this. You've seen this, you've seen this, you've seen this. Seen this. This is Batavia, whoops, Auburn. Oops, sorry. Auburn, New York, I do this for corn silage as well. I figured a planting date of 5/1. When do you guys in this room plant?
As soon as we can.
That's a universal question. That's good. So when I go to farms and when we start doing the analytics thing, I ask them 2 questions, but it's actually 4. When do you plant, or when do you want to plant, and when do you really plant? And when do you chop, and when do you want to chop, and when do you really chop? They're 4 questions. But they're 2, but they're 4. So I like put in, with this climate smart farming, I can put in the planting date, the great base for corn, and I actually can figure out for your individual farm what your growing degree days are for over the last 15 years and 30 years, so you have a pretty good idea so we don't go long on our relative maturity on corn. It kind of helps us reset, because there's so many farms that I do this with, and we're planting 10 days longer than we probably should be. And some of these farms wonder why they're having trouble getting chopped, or why quality tends to go the other way. It's because we're out kicking our seasonal dates. You talk about how early we can get it in, exactly right. This is frost right here. Obviously, we know how to put corn in the ground and the temperatures of soil and when we should put it in. Purdue says that corn will not pop out of the ground until we get between 125 and 140 growing degree days, base 50. So what I go back and do is I'll go back and play with the numbers and toggle them. I'll put in April 25th and I'll put May 10th in. So if you put corn in the ground May 1st, she's going to get to 130 growing degree days by May 17th. So she'll be out of the ground in 17 days. If you put corn in the ground at 5:15, it'll probably be out of the ground, in a day or 2 later, because you're already pretty warm and you're warmer. So I like to look at this because I like to help hone in when we should be planting corn. And, we want to get it in as quick as we can, and the cold germ's usually good on it. But I would suggest that you kind of be familiar with that number and then also familiar with this number. Let's see, I'll skip through this, but this is important for this room more so than yesterday. Initial sugar content required for proper fermentation of halage or baleage. Alfalfa, grass, and corn. Dry matter right here. Does anybody make 25, 28 dry matter halage? What happens when you do? Good or bad? Does it stink? It can get butyric on you. There's a farm that I work with that makes halage, alfalfa halage, and they always make it wet. Can never get it dry. I think they try to make it purposely wet. But I'll come home and my wife's a city girl, and when I walk in the house, she'll tell me, "Ugh, you were at so-and-so's farm today, weren't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She says, "You were in their silo or bunker, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she says, "Yeah, I could tell right where you were, because they're that butyric herd." She calls it the stinky herd, but it's that butyric herd. So with that in mind, Aaron, have you ever seen an alfalfa at 21% sugar?
Yeah, not that I remember.
That's right. So at 25 dry matter, you need 21% sugar for it to ferment, which doesn't happen. We all know that with alfalfa, you're going to be in that 33 to 38 to 40% dry matter typically, and it ferments pretty good, because if you look, we're starting to get into the range of sugar that we actually need for it to ferment by itself. I'm not even talking about inoculant. That's just doing fermenting by itself. When you look at cereal grains like rye, triticale, and sorghum Sudan, there's a lot more sugar content there, so it can ferment at a higher moisture. If you look, you can reach these numbers, these wetter forages. I often see some of these spring forages between 28 and 32, even 25 and 32, and they still ferment really well. I had one guy that in New Hampshire that I worked with this year that planted sorghum Sudan because 85-day corn is too long for them, so we're trying to find alternative forages. So we put it in, and it worked really well. It was 74 NDF 30, great digestibility, great protein, low fiber. On paper, it was like the best sample ever. I looked at the paper, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. Until I looked at two things, dry matter and fermentation. It was 18% dry matter, and it was the slimiest feed in the world. You can get it wet, but you can't get it that wet. And this kind of proves you get it around 17, 18, she ain't going to do it. Especially if you don't have a lot of sun, and then you don't get sugar production. Corn doesn't care because you've got starch and you've got sugars there to do it. I love this chart. This is from Kurt Kotanch. He was at Minor Institute. I didn't say who it was, but this came from actually a different source beyond him. But so a couple top secret things. They're really not secrets. I drive around with a chipper on the back of my truck, which is a whole other story. But I go and I take and chip a lot of corn for farms on the back of my truck, and then I have this NIR machine that actually will get you your dry matter and your starch content in 35 seconds. Any farm can have one. Now they're $18,000, so not any farm wants one, right? But we can get pretty good, and it's really pretty accurate. And I use this all the time to kind of dial in forage and harvest dates. This is a farm Dave knows right where it is, right? So anyways, we track this stuff every year, and he has this stuff on, he uses this in a One Soil app, and we look at all of his corn, and actually you have any new pictures probably told you where it was, but, and I use this as a free app on a phone that Leland hopefully he's downloaded by now, but Leland being in Leland, I don't know if he has yet, but but One Soil, it's free, and what it does is it shows this vegetative index like I had talked about, or the guy before me talked about, looking at forages and looking at them from the satellite. Your forages are already in there, your fields are already in there, I should say. And then you can look at really healthy, 820, we didn't get rain, she got stressed. She got a little dry, she needed a drink, she got a little light yellow. We got a little bit of rain, she greened back up, And then we didn't get any rain from roughly September 7th till we got hammered with frost there. But she was already stressed right before that frost came. She was looking for an excuse to die, and frost gave her the excuse. So I think it's just really nice because I can go to farms and you want to know which 5 fields you should chop first, or which field should I chop at. And I will use this program and I'll look at my phone and we'll walk through the fields visually, and you'll look at all 5 fields and they look the same with our eyes. This looks at things different than we do. It looks at differences between reds and different colors, and the satellite looks at it different. And I will look at those 5 fields, and I'll be standing with the dairyman. He'll go, we got to figure out which ones we're going to chop first. And I'm like, ask the son, like, well, okay, which ones are we looking at? And he says, oh, this one, this one, this one. I'll go, well, here's 5. Here's the lane. Here's the 5 fields you should chop, and which one you should start at and finish at. And I give it to him, and I'm like, here. And it's because of this. I can use it because it sees fields that are a little stressed before we can see them. And this is just more of that same thing where you can track. You can use this on your computer too. Leland can even use it on his computer. Sorry to pick on you, Leland. But if you use it on your computer instead of a phone, it actually has a running total of each field, and you can see your healthiest field to your worst field. And the new thing this year is you can go in and it'll look at nitrogen. And it'll look at nitrogen needs of that field from the satellite, which is pretty amazing to be able to see parts of the field that are, in need of different things. That's about it. I know I'm probably a little over anyways, but thoughts, questions, confusions? Yes, sir.